Welcome in Cannabiz Conversation Season 3. I am so excited for this episode because, as I always tell the story, I'm a 40-something guy who feels now like the old stoner in the room, which is cool, but I like to follow people who get it on a scientific level, who discuss it on a molecular level, if you will, because I don't understand that. People are like, oh, you've been around cannabis your whole life, you know all about cannabinoids and stuff. Actually, I don't. And that's why I follow fine folks like we have on today. So before we get into that, as always, we want to thank Fat Nugs Magazine. Dustin and the crew have been great sponsors. Their premier independent cannabis publication continues to expand the global reach. Equity, legacy, veteran, mom and pop shops. That's who they do business with. If you want to learn more about brand retail partnerships with them, head over to their website, Fat Nugs Magazine, and they will show you the way. I'm telling you, we have it here. It's a great way to showcase people's art. So keep it up, Fat Nugs, and thank you for being a partner. All right, let's get into the show. If you don't know who we have with us today, we'll make a quick introduction. Dr. Allison Justice joins us along with Dr. Riley Kirk. How are you both today?
Doing great.
Doing awesome. Glad to be here.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you for making the time to be here. We appreciate it. So, as is customary on the first half of the show, we get to know our guests by asking about their cannabis origin story. Where did it all start? I'll begin with Allison. Allison, tell us either, when you first found it, when you found it medically, whatever part of the story you want to tell us. How did you first come in contact with this great plant?
Let's see. I don't tell this part of my story too often, so it should be entertaining. I was kind of a late bloomer to cannabis. I actually didn't dive into the great appreciation of the plant until I was 21 in Amsterdam. I tried it for my first time. And after that, obviously, here I am 10 years deep in the industry professionally. So it went well the first time. But, as you'll know from my accent, I'm from South Carolina. I'm from the South. And, it's getting better and better every day, but there's definitely a pretty terrible stigma here on cannabis. And so, me trying it was certainly a later in life thing because, up until then, what I'd always been taught is that's the devil. So, late bloomer in that way. But, as I traveled the world and as I, got through college and saw the different aspects of not just this plant, but people and the world. And, everything is not exactly the same as my little town in South Carolina. My eyes opened up and it really allowed me to bloom in my understanding of a lot of things. So, and kind of where it all meshed to put me in the spot as a career cannabis scientist was, my upbringing was in plants, greenhouse production, field tree production. And so I've always been a plant person and went to school, decided I love school. I love our farm, my family farm, but I wanted to get deeper into the science. And so decided to continue a graduate degree in plants, but at that time, having cannabis as a host plant for your studies was not an option.
Right.
I don't think anywhere actually at that time. Maybe in not Louisiana,
Mississippi.
Mississippi. That one, maybe there, but that was just about it. So all of my work was with ornamentals and poinsettias, which coincidentally has served me well because those ornamentals and cannabis are very similar. Everything from photo period to, the way you propagate them, all extremely similar, and suited me well for my time now. But after I graduated with my PhD in plant science, I decided to move out west and joined the dark side. It was an interesting journey, Riley, as I'm sure you have a very similar experience. You have people that you graduated with going and teaching at Cornell and, having professorial jobs. And here I am like, I'm going out to California and I'm going to go work for a cannabis company. So that was a fun journey. But stayed out in California for about 3.5 years. Worked at a vertically integrated medical marijuana company. and then came back out south when the hemp bill was passed, and created the hemp mine as well as the Cannabis Research Coalition um, with my family, and run the CRC with Ashley Manning, who was on your show before. And we do cannabis science, mainly plant science, ultimately everything from propagation all the way to my deep obsession of drying and curing and trying to figure out that. And those studies are really where Riley and I started collaborating together, and we'll get to that later, but that was kind of our union is, hey, I love plants and I grow plants, so this is my science. She does too, but kind of that next step was put it all together and see what we can do together.
Ah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Let me just circle back here. I mean, for a late bloomer, normally the story is something like college or this. I mean, for your late bloomer story, Allison, that's probably the best I've heard. I mean, Amsterdam, I mean, there's not many people who are like, well, first time I ever tried, the coolest thing that I found was in the coolest place that it was, right? Like that's pretty bitching to hear, I really enjoyed that part of it.
Cool.
But you talk about the South, right? We talk about how difficult that sort of prohibition lifestyle is that exists. I talk about all the time. I live in Wisconsin. It's sort of the same way. It's this Midwest sort of, what's appropriate, what's not. And it takes a while. My wife would consider, I think she just called herself a late bloomer, and she's right around that 20, 21 range as well. And again, I think it's just something that you find as people, there's a different appreciation because, like you said, you're a plant person. So to you, it just kind of makes sense. You're already into the science of why it's there, what it exists for, plants in general. And so yeah, I really love the fact that you're able to take that passion that you were already sort of on the track of and then sort of include when you were available and able. You say the dark side in cannabis as far as going into that side of it, right? In the medical marijuana days. But they were... The medical, because I was on the forefront of the Colorado medical days, and I found it to be much more interesting than I find the whole legalization of full recreational. And I don't know why that is, and I don't know, maybe it's because it's more of the Wild West. Maybe it's because we grew and sold to each other sort of in a wholesale market without, regulation. It was based on growers and people who knew what they were doing and things of that nature. But what did you see about the medical side from your perspective that was like, this is what we need to key in on, this is why I want to be talking about this plant? Like from that experience, where did the school side match with the reality side for you?
Well, that comment was merely the perception of what other people graduating with a PhD or that already had it, thought of me going down this, wild journey of moving to California. But when I did go out to California, it was right when they allowed for recreational, so all the rules were changing and everything was going crazy. And what was really wild for me to see and get to experience firsthand was that transition from medical to recreational. And at that point is when regulations were implemented. When I first got there for, I think it was only the first 6 months, I'm there, it's medical, and we test nothing. I'm asking the people at our dispensary, because home growers are bringing in their flower, and besides looking at it and saying this looks good and maybe here's a COA, like that was that.
No, those were the same rules in Colorado. That was the same. I mean, again, it was about all the people that we had learned from. And again, we hadn't thought of pesticides because we were all doing home grow. So like I opened the season with Trent Hancock, and he'll tell you that really you shouldn't have a problem with molds and things like that if you're 40 plants in a house. It's the 1,000 plants in a huge space, right, that make it harder. But even to that point, Allison, no one ever asked about what you did with it, how you cared for it. It was just, how does it smell? How does it look? Can I move it on my shelf? And it was medical. That was what I mean by the Wild West of it all. Now I feel like science backs it up more, where now it feels like it should be called medical and the recreational stuff should be more, the home grow kind of off the shelf.
Right. It's kind of backwards from that standpoint. Yeah. So just watching that transition over to it being recreational and all these, lab issues we're still struggling with, right? A million years down the road from that point. Yeah, it just like being in the hemp industry, it's always kind of this twofold, like you're grateful for this, but this is a problem. And, how do we ever unite the two to make, a safe product, a product where the grower's not going broke because they're having to spend $5,000 on testing per 3 pounds or something to that extent. So it's tricky. I mean, it's a new industry and there's a lot we're all having to figure out, everything from how you're doing it at the laboratory to how you're growing it to what those regs should be to hemp is on my mind lately because here in South Carolina, their session is happening, and so there's a lot of fighting about what's happening with hemp right now. So that's why I keep referring back to it. But I mean, just speaking of that, being in South Carolina right now, it's kind of like we're medical. Thinking about it, because there's no testing, there's no pesticide, there's nothing like that.
No,
But at
there's
the
nothing.
same time, you can go to in a tiny, tiny town, there's 5 tobacco and vapes of different names, and you can get
We
pretty much anything you can in any legal state.
Yeah, we have
But
the same. We have the same problem here in Wisconsin. With this the hemp without legalization. Your border states are legal for us. Actually, every single one of them now is, except for us, and it causes confusion. I'm a weekly bowling alley kid. I've been in a bowling alley my whole life, and so what happens in my bowling alley is people walk in on Wednesday nights and they'll say, "Hey, Sean, I just bought a THC beverage from the gas station." I'm like, "No, you didn't. You couldn't have done that." And they're like, "No, I really did. Check it out." And it's like, oh gosh, guys, it's hemp derived. It's this. And it's just trying to explain to people and go through these differences. And there's a new dispensary down the street. Like, no, there's not. There's a new smoke shop selling unregulated, God knows where from goods. But Allison, to the point that, have you run into the fact that in these places where maybe you think you should be finding hemp derived, you're actually finding cannabis? Because that has happened to me in small town Wisconsin, where I walk into a smoke shop and I'm like, this is THC. Like, there's nothing else on this label but that. There's no VA. There's no, there's no extras. This is just THC. And people are like, oh, no, it's all hemp. Is that an issue as well in the South?
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't think one person knows, besides the person actually at the table mixing the product,
Yeah.
or who's extracting the hemp or tea. It's all convoluted. It is all convoluted. Yeah, I
It
mean,
makes it hard on
who's to
consumers.
say if
That's my biggest thing is consumer protection, right? Consumers being safe. And I think that just makes it hard on them.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, I'm not worried about the cannabinoids. I'm more worried about what else is in there. I mean, if the THC is being pulled from, a process and extraction from hemp versus, being slipped in from California, from distillate that's extra, it's all to make the same dosage of gummy, let's say. And there's no real way to track that back.
No.
So it's
The
all
tracking part of it, the lack of that, and I get that people say, oh, over-regulation, but in order for consumers to be safe, you need regulation at some level. Like, it's not avoidable to that extent, in my opinion. So, Allison, I love the work. I love what you're doing now. And like I said, I'm so glad to see your journey ends up from Amsterdam at 21 to now, helping run the coalition, helping people do more research and really getting into that. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
You're very welcome.
It's awesome. All right, Riley, let's hear it. I mean, I guess, I don't know, is this going to be hard to follow up? How are you feeling about this? This is your origin story, I assume, doesn't start at 21 in Amsterdam. So tell us where it does begin.
Yeah, no, always hard to follow up Dr. Justice. She's amazing. But yeah, my story starts a bit earlier. I was 14 in Maine when I first started using cannabis and never really stopped after that. It was both my parents used cannabis, not like in front of us all the time, but growing up, like now I understand, like, oh, like they were stoners and they just I just didn't know that at the time. But also I had 2 older brothers and they were true stoners. And it was a way for us to bond, but also like harm reduction growing up. Like I never drank excessive amounts, never got in like really sketchy situations. And I really think cannabis being a big influence in my life was a big part of that. So, I know I'm not necessarily advocating for every 14-year-old to dive into weed, but at the same time, like, like if you're not going to use weed, usually it's something else. And I do think weed is a safer alternative a lot of the time. And, you know, your brain and your body's going through a lot at that time. And again, like my brothers and I were like close. We were friends. We were tight. We hung out. And I think without cannabis, like it wouldn't have been that same situation. It would have been much more volatile. So again, like I started using at that time, used really throughout high school, college, never considered like working in the cannabis industry. I never even thought that was an option for me. It was just kind of this foreign little concept and in the back of the universe that wasn't for me. And I worked in the biotech industry after college, just like doing some basic science stuff, like immune system related projects. And then I was always obsessed with plants as well. So, you know, I always grew a million plants. I always foraged a lot. I still forage a lot for mushrooms as well as plants. And I found this, I was searching because I hated my career in biotech. I'm like, oh my God, I'm doing what a robot could do. This is so boring. So I was searching like for something that I was more passionate about. And I was looking up essentially like plant medicine, just trying to like take herbalism, but make it a little more scientific. And through my research, I found this word pharmacognosy, which a lot of people can't say. I couldn't say it for a long time. But it essentially just means the study of nature and natural products and how we can use nature as drugs, essentially. So I found this word and I looked at pharmacognosy programs in the United States. There's very few. There's like 4 different programs. One of them was in Rhode Island. And I went down there because it was driving distance from where I was living at the time. Applied there, met some professors, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool. This is what I want to do. This is my calling. Had no like apprehensions at all. I'm like 100% I'm into this. So during grad school, I studied dozens of different medicinal plants. I studied cyanobacteria, regular bacteria, fungi, diatoms, like all of these different walks of life and how they could be used for medicine. But again, like I wasn't considering cannabis as a potential career. I was just that stoner who also studied other things like plants. And it wasn't till towards the end of graduate school where the university released a cannabis program and they needed a teaching assistant for that program. And everybody was like, oh, well, Riley should teach it. Like she's the most educated on this plant and she's obviously passionate about it. So I didn't even have to like apply. Like I was the only option for the TA for this course. And part of what I did for that course was making video lectures and video content to help teach the students in a more interactive way, because, you know, nobody wants to read like a full, like, you know, 20-page paper on a specific subject when they can have somebody just talk them through it in a much more entertaining way. Yep. So I started making that video content, and then I just I started to learn more about how much the university was charging for the information about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. And I'm like, that kind of bothers me. I feel like everybody should have access to this information. So I took my skills of like creating that video content. And at this time, TikTok was starting to become, you know, really big, or, you know, these short form content. And I was like, hey, I'm bored. Why not? So I clicked the button, recorded a video about, I think it was like the structure of THC versus CBD or something like that. And that video just absolutely blew up. And then I was like, that was cool. So I did another educational video. And, you know, they all just started gaining so much traction because nobody had been able to kind of take that scientific side of cannabis and break it down for a general consumer. And that's really where my like content creation and educated like social media side started. So after that, I did end up going to the industry and getting a job in the industry where I really focused on chemistry, understanding new compounds, understanding the compounds in cannabis smoke versus vapor versus edibles, kind of these different consumption methods. And then worked there for a few years and eventually started a research and education nonprofit with Dr. Miyabi Shields, who's the research partner that I work with. And both of us are really passionate about kind of just representing the community and data and getting more realistic data, because both of us have worked in academia and you see this crazy split of the data that comes out of academia versus the data that like real consumers are experiencing in their lived experience in their everyday lives. And we never saw that represented in data. So we said, okay, well, let's fill this niche. Let's fill this gap. Let's start collecting this data. So we created this nonprofit called the Network of Applied Pharmacognosy, back to that word, NAP, where we study cannabis, we study cannabinoids, we also study other natural products. Like we have projects going on right now with kava and kratom, which are other medicinal plants. And we're just trying to bring a more realistic lens to natural product research. And we also do biochemical research too, at the receptor level, at the, individual compound level. And our goal is to kind of combine that really rigorous scientific laboratory data with this lived experience of people to get a more nuanced approach of research so that, we can educate people on dosing and quality products and kind of just like realistic information people are looking for rather than this like theory-based stuff that we're kind of used to coming out of the peer review.
I think it's I got to tell you, that's what I think is pretty amazing. I mean, the way that you guys do it, the way that you break down the information to like you said, to that level, it makes sense now following your content, Riley, that you have a history of the plant itself and the passion sort of, collides with that. I'm also part of the 14 Club. Again, I would recommend it. I don't have kids, so it's easy for me to say. I would recommend 14-year-olds getting involved in cannabis over anything else that they will run into. And I would probably include that in everything. Yes, 14-year-olds, if you're going to get into anything, it should be that.
The 14 Club, that's too funny.
I'm sure my team's going to clip that and make that terrible. But it does not matter. My point remains the same. It's still a better alternative. No, Riley, so you're growing up into this. You're seeing this part of the world sort of come together. What I like a lot is that you talk about the consumer version, right? You talk about taking science, making it consumable, where we can I can get it, right? And I think that that's really the work that I think fascinates people. And I think that's why it does well on social, because I think people are just like, let's take this show, for example. It's an hour-long show. We're going to bust it up into a bunch of 30-second clips that people are probably going to consume more of than the actual show itself. And it's because it's a distance thing. It's a time thing. So your video creation, and I'm not here to find out ages, Riley. I'm not asking that. What I'm trying to figure out, though, is I don't know when TikTok started because I don't pay attention to that stuff. But how long, what year were you creating video content for education before it got on the social media? When were you doing that? In what year?
I think it was 2019. I made my first short form video.
Okay, awesome. That's what I'm talking about. That is so far ahead of a curve, right?
I'm so glad I hopped on when I did, though, because if I tried right now, it's so saturated and the community guidelines have changed so much that it's so much more difficult to actually talk about this plant at this point.
That's what I'm saying to you, is that you're ahead of something, right? It's like people talk about the banking stuff. Like when we were in cannabis and medical in Colorado, we all banked with Chase Bank. Nobody said shit. Chase Bank took our money. They put our money in. They put our money out. We all had green in our names. They knew what we were doing, but no one cared because they didn't have to, because it wasn't that way. And so you're ahead of it. Here you are. Community guidelines don't matter because they're not made up yet, because nobody knows what you're talking about.
Oh, 100%. Oh, it was such a game changer. And also I think cannabis a lot for my mentality towards everything, because I'm like, hey, why not try it? Sounds like fun. Where everyone else is like, TikTok, that's for the 10-year-olds, and they're being judgy. And it's like, joke's on you, because I built my whole career from making my first TikTok video. So
I mean, the joke is on most people when it comes to social media that still don't realize the value of it and how it can actually grow and become something of that. But I love it right there, the mindset. The cannabis mindset. I am a daily user. I make the joke. The last time I didn't use cannabis was 30 days, was the 30 days before I found it when I was 14. That's how it's always been. And I've always been open to it. Now, has that led me to peyote in the desert? Sure. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it did, because I'm allowing myself to just say, yeah, let's do this. Let's see where we can go. But Riley, in your world now, you're taking that mind expansion that you're naturally having and you're combining it with science. What is that like for you, just kind of tomorrow when Riley wakes up? What is it like to have kind of your lot in life as it sits right now with what you've created? Because I think commonly people think of us daily users, longtime users as, lazy or this or that, and these stereotypes that exist. What's it like waking up for Riley tomorrow in the life that she's put herself in?
It's actually like kind of low key a lot of pressure because I do understand that I do represent a lot of people in the industry, like giving people a voice, and like our nonprofit in general does. And our data means everything to us. Like we have data on over 5,000 consumers with over 2 weeks of consumption. We have all this laboratory data. And, I think something people always talk to us about is like, okay, why aren't you selling that data? There's so many vape companies that want to know how many times people are vaping in a day and what they're vaping. And it's like, yes, but we're also very careful with our data because the reason we have so much valuable data is because our community trusts us because we are one of the community. It's not us versus them. It's, us together. So we're very careful with what we do with our data and who we share it with. And of course, that's had financial limitations to our growth. But at the same time, maintaining that trust within the community is absolutely everything to us. So, no matter what topic we're talking about, we're really trying to represent the community in the best way possible and represent the data in the best way possible. We have such sensitive data on cannabis and pregnancy, cannabis and driving, these topics that are highly stigmatized. And if they did get into the wrong hands, like that could be skewed in a potentially negative way. But we don't believe it's negative data because the data is showing overall positive effects for people's lives. So it's really shaping that narrative and making sure we're just very, very careful with the research studies we do, the people we collaborate with, and who we share the data with.
And that seems more than fair because data is the ultimate currency in today's world. Like in my real life, I call it my real life, I run an automotive data consulting company and have for over a decade. And I've been a nerd of all data that I can get my hands on because I believe what I see, what I feel, what I touch, and I watch impact based on that. So I love what you're doing. And again, I'm a consumer advocate at heart. I am not plant touching at this point in my life. This is what I do. We have some background in funding and helping people with consulting and stuff like that. But ultimately, I've been in the background of cannabis for 20 years. And I love watching the forefront of it. And I think that folks like you, like Allison, are really trying to help push things forward. And I just wish that people would have just a little bit more patience for what's happening here. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, this is a multi-quadrillion billion dollar freaking industry by the time it's all said and done. And I think we all feel like we should already be at the end point where we all have our feet kicked up and everyone gets it and everyone shares it, but it's not. Okay. I was just in Denver, Colorado, the OG of medicals, to some extent, more recreational, I guess. First one to do it. It is not obvious what goes on at bars or venues for music. You can't just go smoke a joint. It's not as free as you would think. And it's different styles of engagement, even in an original state. So I just wish people would take time. Research takes time. And Riley, I'll let you speak on this. Then we'll go to Allison to close out the first half. But from your position, is it getting easier or harder trying to do research around this plant? And I mean that either from the government perspective, from the participant perspective, just what is the thought there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting a little easier, but that's also because we're taking a more decentralized approach to it. I think in academic institutions, it is very difficult because it's not federally legal. Like, even if their state or their institution is like, okay, you have the green light, still they're like, okay, well, I don't want to touch this because if we end up getting in trouble in some way, like we're going to lose all of this. But the work that we do, the work that Dr. Justice does, it's really independently funded for the most part, meaning like through the industry or through, private funding, which I think gives us a little bit more leniency in being able to research things, especially in a more practical way. We also we get really creative in the cannabis industry. Like there's always a way. We always find a way. Look at the hemp industry. There's always a way, right? So I think using that mentality too, and thinking about creative ways that we can get data and that we can kind of get around some of these obstacles. Some of the work that Allison and I have done together, we've had to get really, really creative because we've reached some pretty big obstacles. But I would also, to your point, Sean, is to anyone who's really, really stoked about the research we're doing or the research someone else is doing, you got to understand how long research takes. It's not like you collect data and 40 seconds later you put it on LinkedIn. That's not the way it works. It's a really, really long process, especially if you're kind of trying to do it in a more traditional way, like peer reviewed research, which is what we're trying to do with the projects that we collaborate on. And you have to understand that takes months to analyze the data, months to write up the papers, months to get it, submitted and then reviewed by those people, and then even maybe a few more months before it's actually published. So, just having patience with the researchers who are trying to do it correctly, that is definitely one way that you can help us out, is just being a little patient with our whole process.
I love that. Patience. Allison, what would you add to that?
I'm gonna double up on that with you, Riley. We've in our Science of Smokability study that we're collaborating on, we finished the project itself, which, everything we're doing is new, using the smoking machine, understanding that the smoking machine has traditionally been used for tobacco, the hurdles that have to be jumped through for that, every step of the way there's hurdles because this is all new. We're taking old science or old equipment and revamping it. And so there's guidance, but it's also new and there's a lot to jump through. And like Riley said, it takes a lot of time to get 5 PhDs together to write this paper, not even talking about the project, the experimentation itself, but getting together, writing it, doing this process, having everything lined up, sending it out to the processor, having that accepted, it all takes a long time. So just, the industry being patient on the promises that we're going to pull through with, but,
I like that.
Universities take a long time to do projects, and compared to them, we're really fast. But I think just the general public doesn't necessarily realize how long some of these things
Yeah,
take.
I'm a pretty terrible red tape guy. That's why I own my own company and sort of forge my own roads. That's why I got out of corporate life, because I just was like, guys, I just want to do this. They're like, well, we got to get approval and we got to get this. I'm like, no. That's by the time you get back to me, I'm not going to care anymore. So let me just go do this now. Let me get this fixed, and then I'll come back to you guys. We'll circle back, and then we can, and it didn't work that way. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I think that being independently funded, being outside the university scope, again, not a college kid at all. That's not where I spent my life, but I know that it takes time to go through those steps. So maybe you eliminate some hurdles while adding others. And I love the repurposing of that product, as far as the smokability, talking about the smoke machines and tobacco. And I think there's, easy correlations for the consumer to say, okay, well, they tested that and we're testing this, and you can do that. But to your end, it's a different look. It's a different extraction of the data point than maybe it was, when it was used 30 years ago, whatever the case was. So,
and
that's
just
really very cool.
The machine is just like, there's way more like resin production in cannabis. And, these are kind of, you can maybe foresee these obstacles coming, but when you're actually running it for the first time, and again, like Dr. Justice was saying, you have a bunch of PhDs, like our time is expensive. And when we're all together and you hit these big obstacles, it's like, okay, well, we need to troubleshoot this. We need to figure this out. We need to, figure out what's going on. You're trying to call the manufacturer of the machine who happens to be on the other side of the world. And your time difference is like, crazy. And we're like working. Alice and I were literally working till like midnight on the first Science of Smokability experiments, because we were just troubleshooting like into the wee hours of the morning. So it was a big learning curve.
Well, the dedication is clearly there. We do love that. I get a feeling I know where we're headed in the second half, but Allison, you want to tell us what we're talking about in the second half?
Yeah, I say we talk about the Science of Smokability. And so that is a project between Riley Miyabi and NAP, their company, as well as the CRC and Dr. Marcus Rogan with his company. So yeah, we want to tell you about our projects we got going on, where we're at in the timeline, and what we're going to do.
I love it. The Science of Smokability. I think it's important for everyone to be hearing this. We're going to be talking all about it on part 2. Thank you both for joining me today. Everybody, don't forget, Fat Nugs Magazine, today's sponsor. If you're not familiar with Dustin and his crew, go out and familiarize yourself with them. They have one of the coolest brands. I have these magazines out. It always raises questions in my house. What is this about? What is this? They read about people. They learn about the plant. If you're a business, mom and pop, small shops, Dustin's your guy. Reach out to him. Fat Nugs Magazine. Find out more on their website, or frankly on social media. Dude is everywhere and seems to get the attention of many. So thank you, Dustin, for that. And Fat Nugs, we appreciate you. All right. Remember, this show is all about removing the stigma, uplifting the plant. We're going to do it together. Let's make it happen. We'll see you for part 2.